Hi guys. At Armada Technologies for the last 10 years, we've taught you a lot of different techniques on electrical troubleshooting. We've done over 40 videos, we've got an app, we've got lots of documentation. Today, we're going to show you the crown jewel of our line and why you need to consider a digital wire and valve locator versus the analog that you've been using for years. This locator has a lot of features that you're not going to have seen before, so if you'll come along with us for 10 minutes, we'll give you a tour. We're going to give you a quick tour of the locator before we get into the meat and the potatoes. We're inside actually because it's raining outside, but that's not going to bother us in here. This is the Pro900, and again, I'll just give you a quick overview of some of the features it has on it. An inventory, shall we say. Okay, first of all, this is the inductive clamp here. We'll get to that in detail in a minute. Ground stake for a traditional locate. The D batteries are located here, like you're used to, but we also have an AC adapter, not a charger, it's an adapter. And it's going to plug into this port here and allow you to use the locator, the transmitter, on an AC power outlet.
Yeah, there'll be some times when you find your D batteries are dead or they're missing or something. If you can get anywhere near an AC outlet, this will allow you to continue working.
Here we have the headset. You guys are all familiar with headsets. This one's a little bit different though, because what we found was cost of ownership using stereo headsets, which is what this is, stereo, is a lot less expensive than having to find those unique mono headsets that we've had in the past. Stereo you can get anywhere.
Yeah, and if you don't like having this weight, or if it's a hot day, you don't like having this on your head, you can go to earbuds. Anywhere you buy a stereo headset, you can be using with this.
And headsets, of course, are optional. We also have speaker in the wand. But this is basically how we turn it on and where you're going to do all your setup function.
When you first turn the unit on, you get a splash screen that has the company name on it, but it goes immediately to a control, very simple digital control panel. I can select either the broadcast or clamp mode, or the more conventional clip-on. The unit comes with cords, of course, that go with the ground stake for the conventional type locating that you're more familiar with than we have covered in earlier videos. One of the important things about this unit is the broadcast function, and I can select it here by just pushing the button. I'm getting a little antenna indicator, and right now what's happening is this broadcast antenna in here is putting out our big non-contact tracing signal. If we chose to use the clamp instead of the broadcast antenna, we simply plug the clamp in and it bypasses this antenna, so you can switch modes back and forth very easily. You don't have to touch the control panel, the power's automatic.
You'll also notice we've taken a lot of the analog controls and indicators off and replaced them with digital. So here on the screen you see what we call a gas gauge, which is basically a battery indicator gauge, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah.
So it's going to tell you where your batteries are if you're using battery, but again, I'd use the AC first and foremost. If you don't want to use this broadcast mode, you hit done, it's going to take you out, and then Jim's going to show you the setup menu for the first time. When you first get it, there's a setup menu you're going to go through to set it up the way you want to.
Yeah, you don't have to touch setup usually after you get the unit and get it configured the way you want, but when you go to setup, when you get here, it gives you ability to cause the unit to power itself down automatically after a certain period of time, or to never shut itself off. That's one of the things that you can select. When you're in this menu, use the arrow keys on the one side to go through the choices that you have. Right now we're configured to use ordinary alkaline D-cell batteries. You can configure it so you can use rechargeable batteries, which are a little bit different voltage. That's one of the functions.
But this is not a recharger, this is an AC adapter.
Right,
So.
if you use D-cells, for instance, lithium ion or some other technique, when you put those batteries in here, you charge them elsewhere, put the batteries in here, you need to change this. That's not a very common thing that people do. You can change the contrast on the screen if you're working a lot outside, if it's a gray day, if it's a very bright day. I'm from Arizona, we have a lot of issues with bright sunlight and LCD displays. You can change the contrast to suit yourself. Backlight.
Not so much today, apparently.
Yeah, and there's a backlight. Depending on how often you work in low light, you can control that. For that matter, you can reduce the backlight and increase the battery life. But pattern is an interesting function. One of the things that we did with this locator is we made it so you can either have a tracing signal that's going beep, 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 or have a steady tone, a beep, and it's more like a little metal detector sort of when you're doing that. As you sweep over the wire, you just get stronger signals instead of stronger beep beeping. So there are just a few things that you can set in here, but some of those are interesting and important, like the pattern. So when you're done doing these things, you can just say back, and I'm back at the main menu. And in this case, we just ran to the broadcast, but if I want to go to the more conventional direct clip-on mode, I'm at a screen that allows me to use these clips and the ground stake to do kind of conventional clip-on locating. One of the differences with this model is we have 2 frequencies on the transmitter. And the significance of that is that the low and high frequencies are used in slightly different applications. The most common conventional irrigation locators use a low frequency. They go for long distances and they can be heard very deep in the ground. Sometimes you're working with things like landscape lighting or even short or cut irrigation wires. You need to switch to the higher frequency. It's easier to detect that. If it's just laying in the mulch, it's not getting a good ground conducting signal. You can go to the high frequency and it's easier to find. So it has 8 power signal levels, but as I say, if you go start with a low power level to begin with, you'll probably be happier. One of the things that happens, this also has a little battery meter in here, or gas gauge if you want, like the battery. When you have a good signal going out, you start to see the meter increase. In fact, if you've got a good quality indicator when you're doing a clip-on location, in our older style, if you've got a good signal in the meter, that was showing you had a good quality locate going on. With this one, the bar starts to kick up, and you get a little indicator there to show you've got a good locate happening. So
it says okay, right?
It says okay.
Yep.
That means you've probably got enough signal going into the wire to get a good locate.
On the old locators, you had that 5 or 6 position switch. This is replacing that.
Right, and this indicator on the screen is replacing the meter, basically.
Okay, so that's the screen and how we set it up.
Yeah, when you're done with this mode, if you're not using direct clip-on, you can go back to idle by selecting done, and when you're through with the unit generally, you can just turn it off with the power key.
On the wand, this is the wand for the unit. Same thing, it's digital. Turn it on. Oops, didn't hold it down long enough. Got the same kind of digital screen. You're going to have the same menu setup that we had here before, but it's going to be directed towards the wand. You can set it up as null or peak. Over here is going to be my volume control. One thing to note is when you set up the locator on a certain frequency, like low, the wand also has to be on low. They have to be matched to work together.
Well, we thought we'd show the Pro900 in the most conventional mode, which is direct clip-on and using the ground stake and the wires that come with the unit. This is a good mode to use it in. It has several other modes, but the direct clip-on gets you the best range and the best signal clarity, and so it's a good place to start if you can. A very conventional setup. We've got an irrigation controller that's in a garage, and we need to do some tracking of valves and wires in the property area, so we'll show you how we do that with this. One thing I should point out, you may notice that we put the ground wire out through the window and into the ground outside. It's important that you have an outside ground directly in the ground to do this kind of tracing. One of the Pro900 features I want to point out, since we're here, one of the nice things about being in a garage like this is very often there's an AC outlet nearby. If I want to conserve my batteries, I can simply plug in our AC adapter and plug it into the unit here and power directly from the wall instead of consuming the batteries. When I'm plugged in, I get a signal, an indication on the screen that says external power, so you know that you're plugged in and working. So I'm going to leave it working with that and saving my batteries. I'm going to trace zone 1 here, so I've removed the zone 1 wire. And
this is a traditional setup that you've used before, years, for the last 30, 40 years on tracking irrigation wire and tracking valves. So the setup we're doing here is very similar or identical to what you're probably familiar with.
Except for things like the external power capability and the way the screens are controlled, it's a high-powered, low-frequency or high-frequency locator. And when I want to start into this mode, I'm connected to a ground stake outside, I'm connected to the wire I'm trying to trace here, and I select the direct clip-on mode from the front panel here. I'm looking at my power indicator and it shows an OK. That tells me I'm actually connected to a traceable wire. I've got good signals going out into the field. I'm satisfied now that I'm going to be able to get my wand out and follow the path of the wire.
When Jim mentions that the indicator here says OK, that is replacing what you're familiar with on the analog receivers, or excuse me, analog transmitters. In the old days when you set up this locate on a 700 or an 800, the analog meter would be, we would ask you to have at least 4 or higher on that analog meter. This basically replaces that. If it says OK, it's the same thing as being over 4 on a 700 or an 800.
Yeah, when I see this OK signal on the panel, I know I'm good to locate. I pick up my wand, I'm going to be getting a good track, and I'm confident. So this is also the mode where I can select high or low frequency because I'm doing sort of conventional irrigation locate and I've probably got good conditions. I'm going to leave it in the low frequency. And I should also mention, when we're doing this kind of tracking, or tracking this red zone 1 wire, when you're actually out doing tracking, you make sure and lift the common wire. You'll get a much better trace when you're doing that. So I should mention that I haven't done that here. So let's go have a look at how it sounds when we try to track a wire outside.
We've been talking to you about a digital locator versus analog, so I want to show you a close-up on what the wand looks like and how it acts, how you set it up before we get started here. Going to push the button here. Always got to push it a little bit longer. It's going to come up with a menu. In the valve locating and wire tracking for irrigation mode, you're going to want to start out with low frequency. So this one defaults to low frequency, clip on low frequency. That's what that means up there. So in this setting, all I got to do is push start, and I'm locating. Okay, now this screen's going to come up. I can choose between peak or null. Everybody's familiar with null. That's where you have no signal in the notch. That's what your 700s and 800s work like now. I can switch to peak, and that's going to be max signal over the wire, not a notched signal over the wire. What's really nice about this locator, and we'll show it later, is this is the bar graph up here to show you how strong the signal is, and there's a number there. If you watch that number, you can hear or see very subtle differences in the signal strength on the wand. So really, really helpful to have that number. It goes from 0 to 100. Over here to the right is my volume control, and as I move it up with the up arrow, you can see that little bar graph change. That's going to be your volume control. And again, on the left-hand side, I have my, I call it gas gauge, but that's my battery condition, okay? So I'm ready to go. I'm going to put it in null mode. The locator is already set up, so let's go try this. So we've set up the transmitter, and we're going to show you the wand in use. So I'm going to turn it on. Takes a second for the software to load up. I'm going to hit start for low frequency. I'm going to turn the volume up. And just like a traditional analog locator, you're going to hear that beeping signal, and I'm going to look for a null. There's my notch, okay? And I'm going to track it just like I would track an analog, okay? So very, very similar. Now, we talked about earlier that you can also use this in continuous mode, so I'm going to have Jim change the signal from this beeping signal to continuous just to give you an idea what it's like. Okay, so Jim, can you change that? I'll set my volume up. Okay, we've got it. Now, instead of hearing that beeping, I hear a solid signal. I still get my null, but I have a solid signal. Where I like this personally, and you may or may not, is if I'm trying to find damage in a cable, it's a lot easier for me to listen to a solid tone and listen for an inflection or a difference than it is for a beeping signal. That beeping's on, off, on, off, on, off. This is nice and solid. So as I go over it, same null signal, just a little different. It gives you an option on this. Now, one of the things I also wanted to reiterate here is, you know, we're talking about a digital locator versus an analog locator, right? And we're trying to show you why you would want to have a digital versus an analog. And I can boil it down for probably the number one feature is when I go through here, there's electrical service that runs through this area. You're not hearing anything except for the tone that that transmitter is putting out, right? So in a digital system, we set these up in this case for a 2 kilohertz frequency. When that locator hears a 2 kilohertz frequency, it transmits that signal into a speaker or into a graph to show you're getting that signal. But if that frequency was 1800 kilohertz or 3000 or interference at 60 hertz, the harmonics of that, it looks at that and goes, that's not 2 kilohertz. I'm not supposed to tell the user that that's there, so I'm not going to. It rejects all of that, okay? So one of the big, huge advantages, and it's built into this wand, is you're not going to get interference when you're around electrical services. That's what we're point on the receiver. I did mention actually in the overview, but I want to show it in person. Null versus peak. We all know what null is because we used it on our old locators or our 700s and 800s. So it's always that notch of no signal. Peak, of course, is the opposite. So if I go over this cable, and I know it's right there because there's my null, now watch what happens when I turn it over to peak. It gets louder over that cable versus quieter, okay? And the other thing that's interesting about this, again, is on the receiver, there is a graph, but there's also a little number underneath that graph that gives you the relative strength that you're seeing. And on peak, that's very handy because that number is pretty sensitive. I'm seeing 23, 26, 27, 29, 31, 33, peaked out, right there, 38. Now if I go a little bit to the right, it's going back down to the 20s. If I go a little bit to the left, it goes to the 20s again. One thing to note, whenever you're using a wand for locating cables, keep the volume as low as you can keep it and still hear it pretty easily. Because if I crank this thing up, it's going to say 100 all the way across that area that I just went over. You want to keep it low enough so it's able to give you a numeric number that's meaningful to you. So that's peak versus null. Okay, in this segment we want to talk about something that really makes this locator different from your old analogs, and that is the inductive possibilities that it has, both with the clamp and the antenna. In this segment we're going to talk about the clamp. Inductive clamp is an idea that we didn't invent. It's been around for a long time in the cable TV industry, but we're the first ones to put it into a wire and valve locator, and it's extremely handy. What it essentially is the ability to put a signal, a tracing signal, on a cable without disconnecting that cable, without shutting the power off, without doing anything other than clamping around that cable. So in the irrigation world, you could use this, well, frankly, I use it around my house to track cable TV cables and electrical cables. I hate electricity, frankly. I don't want to touch it. I don't want to mess with it. I don't have to with this. I can put it right over the electrical signal. If I had electrical cable here, you just clamp it right around. It's
safety is an important aspect of that, because in a conventional locator, you might have to actually disconnect the electrical cable and connect to the wire in order to trace it, or even connect to the neutral or shield. But with a thing like this, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about electricians. You can just clamp over a power cable or anything, and completely safe because it's not in contact with the wire.
Instead of me rambling on about how this works, let's show you how it works. So on the main menu, the startup screen on the transmitter, there's a button here called Broadcaster Clamp. When I activate this by pushing it down, I'm now sending out a signal through the inductive antenna. But remember, we're trying to use the clamp here. So to activate the clamp, we're going to insert it into the port here with the clamp icon. Now the inductive antenna shuts off and the clamp is what's active. So Jim is going to place that on a cable here. Okay, and that's all you got to do. In the last segment we talked about the inductive clamp and how you use that with the Pro900. In this segment I want to talk to you about the inductive antenna. This is it works similarly to the inductive clamp, but I'd say the analogy is the clamp is a rifle if the inductive antenna is a shotgun. So the inductive antenna is built in here. It doesn't connect directly to a cable. We're going to activate this antenna here. It's going to radiate a signal in all directions, and if a cable runs through the path, that cable is going to pick it up and we're going to be able to track it.
Like the clamp, the antenna is a connectionless way of tracking a cable. We want to make sure that we don't have to touch the wires, or if we can't touch the wires, we can use this broadcast mode to locate the cable.
You put the transmitter in the broadcast mode exactly the same as you do with the clamp, so we don't need to tell you how to do that again. It's just good enough to know that we know there's some cables running out through this building out in this direction, and by placing this inductive antenna in the proximity of those cables, we're inducing a signal to that cable. So.
One of the beauties of this broadcast mode, the fact that it spreads out, you may be tracking a cable you're especially interested in, but you may also wonder whether there's a cable for another purpose already buried in the ground you're going to work with. This will light up both of those types, so you can use it to avoid as well as locate.
One of the reasons I like to use the clamp over the antenna is there's a couple of downsides to it. Number one is if you're within 20 feet of this antenna, you're not going to be able to trace a cable because it's going to pick up. You're going to be picking up the signal from the box, not from the cable that has got the induced signal onto it. Number two, it is not discriminatory. It's like a shotgun. So if there's 3 cables running around here, you're going to pick up all 3, and you're going to have to deduce which one it is you're looking for. So again, I prefer the clamp, but the broadcast is available. There are some applications though where it is about the only thing you'll be able to use it on. So for example, grandma's got her garage door locked up. You can't get at the controller. Well, how are you going to map out the wires if you can't get into the clock? One of the ways we've used this in the past is we'll take the broadcast antenna, place it on top of a valve box, and light up the entire irrigation system by doing it that way. So this is the broadcast antenna. Works really well in the right situation. It's something you may not be familiar with from a traditional analog wire and valve locator.